Welcome back to The Heat. We're discussing Colombia's efforts to reach a final peace deal with the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, known as FARC. Joining us now is Dr. Cynthia Arnson. She's the director of the Latin American program at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars right here in Washington, D.C. Also with us from New York is Aldo Civico. He's a columnist for El Spectador and the author of The Parastate, an ethnography of Colombia's death squads. Thanks to both of you for joining us. Cindy, let me start with you. So the two sides are close to an agreement. We could have a deal signed by as early as next month. Do you believe this is a major turning point in Colombia? Will this deal work?
Those are two very different questions. I think this is an incredibly important turning point in Colombia. It is the official end to a conflict that has gone on for over 50 years, that has caused millions of victims, untold destruction of the environment, and pain and suffering to displaced peoples and to people in particularly rural areas that have borne the brunt of this conflict. So putting an end to it with the FARC, the largest guerrilla group, is undoubtedly a major, major achievement. There is still a smaller guerrilla organization, the National Liberation Army, that has not entered into a peace process. So it's not the case that the war is over. There is still a lot of important work to be done. Whether this will be implemented fully, and whether all the parties that have been signatories to the accord, as well as the public, are ready in letter and in spirit to implement the agreement and all of these very difficult areas of rural development and reintegration and reconciliation. I mean, that is really a task looking forward. I'm optimistic, but it is not going to be easy.
Aldo, what were the root causes of this conflict, and does this agreement address those causes?
Yeah, so in the narrative of the FARC guerrilla, the main issue was really land tenure and access to power. So the initial idea of arming themselves was to fight against the elite of the country, taking over power and leading a revolution. Of course, at this point, after fighting for more than 50 years, the FARC understood that that's not an achievable goal, but yet in the first point of the negotiation agenda, the agrarian rural development was the first point on which not only was discussed, but on which also there was a significant and historical agreement achieved. So I think in that sense, we can see these peace talks for the FARC on behalf of the government also as a sort of a golden bridge, allowing for some concession, admitting that that is an important issue, not just for the FARC, but for the country, and trying to move on from there.
Cindy, the former Colombian President Andrés Pastrana was interviewed by my colleague Elaine Reyes recently here in Washington. Let's listen to what former President Pastrana had to say.
The peace process is not the end of violence in Colombia. That's one of the things. Because still we have to deal with two big problems. Still we have some paramilitary groups in our country, and those are involved also in the drug business. And we will still have to deal with narco-trafficking. You could achieve the peace process, but if the FARC, if they don't tell us Colombians the truth, it's going to be very difficult to end the narco-trafficking in our countries.
So two issues addressed. The one that you've mentioned already, the fact that not all groups have signed on to this peace deal. There are groups which are still on the outside, and the other, of course, is drug gangs. How will the government address these two issues?
It's not exactly clear. What has happened is that there are new generations of so-called paramilitary groups. They're referred to in Colombia by the acronym BACRIM, which stands for Bandas Criminales, criminal bands. They are in many ways the successor organizations of paramilitary groups that demobilized following a peace process with the Uribe administration in the beginning of the 2000s. This peace agreement is not going to do away with narco-trafficking, with organized crime in Colombia, which has existed for many decades, which the FARC is fully involved in, and which it in many ways managed to take over in certain respects. I think the hope is that there will be a different way of fighting coca cultivation, of giving peasants that have grown coca. Colombia has regained the status of the #1 country where coca is cultivated, there will be the possibility for a very integrated rural strategy that will try to eradicate the coca crop. The other hope, I think, is that when the government is no longer battling this very powerful insurgency, that it will be able to turn its efforts and its focus more to combating organized crime. And one has to really deal with multiple manifestations at the local level, at the regional level, at the national level, and not just adopt a strategy that has been employed in Colombia and in Mexico of simply going after the capos at the head of this chain. It has to really be combated at multiple levels.
Right. Aldo, what is your view on this? I mean, how big is the drug business in Colombia, and how much of a threat do these drug gangs or cartels pose to the government?
Yeah, first of all, let me tell you that I think that even on this issue, the decision of the FARC, and I think this is actually the fundamental decision they made, the fundamental decision to end the conflict, to lay down the arms, and to enter a peace process is also a decision that will affect the fight against narco-trafficking. In fact, that was a major point in the agenda, and there has been some agreement on how to deal with it. I agree with Pastrana that the peace process in itself would not solve the problem, and yet it is a step forward because you will not have anymore the justification, the excuse on behalf of the FARC to enter into deals with the cocaine world and networks and crime in order to support and finance the war and to contrast the force of the military. So it will be significant in that sense, the collaboration of the FARC to at least reduce. What we will see yet is that other cartels, also transnational cartels, like the Mexican cartels, who have already a significant presence and control over Colombia, but it will be a different framework from which we will look at the problem, because it will be more in terms of fighting organized crime. It will be more within the framework of law enforcement and not of a political armed conflict that has been going on for half a century.
Cindy, if we look at some of the nuts and bolts of this peace agreement, there is a mechanism within the agreement which calls for FARC leaders, FARC members to confess to what they've done before special tribunals. We just heard from our earlier guest, Senator Paloma Valencia, saying that this is not good enough. These FARC members and FARC leaders have to be punished. I mean, is that a realistic thing? Will it help in any way towards reconciliation and rebuilding the country?
The Accord on Transitional Justice was probably, in fact, it was the most difficult agreement within the peace negotiations. It took close to a year and a half to negotiate it because the Colombian government, backed by a very strong demand from Colombian society for accountability, could not just allow the FARC to lay down its weapons, integrate into society, and go scot-free. But the government was also constrained by the fact that the FARC has about 6 or 7, maybe even 8,000 fighters. It was not militarily defeated. This was not a surrender, and the accord would have fallen apart. The negotiations would not have prospered if the offer to the FARC was simply lay down your weapons and go to jail. So this issue of transitional justice is probably the hardest in any peace process. And as you mentioned, there's a special tribunal that has been set up to judge FARC commanders. People who confess fully can be condemned and sentenced to an alternative form of restriction of liberty. That's almost a direct quote from the language of the peace agreement. And for many people in Colombia, that is not strong enough. They want to see FARC members behind bars for the atrocities that they have committed, over a period of decades: attacks on civilians, kidnapping, forced displacement, the recruitment of minors. I mean, the list is very long. But it's notable that the kinds of provisions that cover the FARC will also cover members of the armed forces. So I think within the human rights community and society in general, there's a sense that the provisions of the peace accord on transitional justice are not tough enough. But I am a pragmatist on these questions. I agree with what President Santos said during his time in Washington this week, that having the mere existence of an armed conflict is itself a form of violation of human rights. And so ending that and ending the terrible burden that it has placed on Colombian civilians, particularly in rural areas, is a step forward in human rights protection.
And Aldo, what about the role the United States should be playing in rebuilding Colombia? It has, of course, been closely involved in this war against FARC. I want you to take a listen to one of the FARC leaders, Pastor Alape, and what he had to say. Let's watch.
A country, the United States, that was engaged in the conflict in Colombia should also be engaged in building a new era, with resources for peace, for reconciliation, and for the prosperity of all those who suffered, with an emphasis on the victims.
So, Aldo, we had President Santos meet with President Obama. He wants FARC taken off the terrorism list. He wants the United States to help with the major challenges that Colombia faces right now. What should the United States be doing right now?
I actually think that the role of the United States will be very important in the post-conflict area, and probably if up to now the emphasis through Plan Colombia was really majorly on security and creating the condition for highly efficient and military and having the hard way to fight the FARC, I think now the emphasis should be actually on helping guaranteeing and creating the condition for a better social equality, for development, for guaranteeing the human rights, especially of those activists who are out there in the rural areas and who are constantly still targeted by different kinds of group and interest. So I think the emphasis on economic development, social development, and justice should be now the new emphasis of the United States. The United States has a huge stake in Colombia, has been part in that sense of the conflict. It was not a neutral actor. It should play a definite role in assuring the rule of law and helping the country move towards peace and reconciliation.
Cindy, you had a chance to host President Santos at the Wilson Center. What were your impressions of him? Do you believe that his government can change the hearts and minds of people?
Well, I think it was a sort of bases-loaded home run, to use a baseball metaphor. I know that's not very popular where soccer is the principal sport, but he really came across as a world-class statesman. He spoke without notes. He spoke from a seated position, not from a lectern, and came with a message first of thanking the United States and thanking the U.S., the American people for its support over these 15 years of Plan Colombia, and talking about what the peace accord was attempting to achieve. And I think the timing could not have been better. There have been really significant advances. I think, if it's not actually signed on March 23rd, which is the deadline that the government and the FARC set last September, it will be pretty darn close. So he is really here in Washington at the time when the country is really on the cusp of concluding this very difficult negotiation with this large, powerful, and really reviled guerrilla army.
Aldo, what about those groups that are not signing on to this agreement, that are still outside, that still pose a threat to Colombia? What about them? What happens to them?
Yeah. So, well, the ELN has been engaged now for some times in pre-talks, and we are hoping that in the next weeks we can have the good news that they are joining a formal peace process and an open and a public peace process like the FARC did in Cuba, in Havana. I think this is absolutely a very important step, and it's also here a very important issue is the issue of timing, because I personally see it a little bit problematic if the FARC is able to sign an agreement with the government without actually having advanced on the negotiation with the ELN, because a signed agreement with the FARC would mean then that the government has to use the same kind of criteria in terms of, for example, transitional justice, and the FARC, and the ELN would have just to accept it. And I can see the ELN being reluctant to do that. So we hope that the facilitators who are involved may be able to accelerate the phase of the pre-talks so that the ELN can soon join the talks and so that we might have an agreement with both the guerrilla that put the country forward.